The summer of 1943 did not simply arrive in Sicily. It crashed over it like a tide that refused to recede. A tide pulled by the weight of nations, by the desperation of armies, and by the calculations of leaders who believed the fate of continents would be decided in its dust-covered hills. When the first Allied ships appeared on the horizon, the island was already trembling under the distant hum of engines, echoes of a new world pressing against an old one. Soldiers on the beaches felt the vibrations through their boots long before they saw the silhouettes of battleships rising out of the dawn haze. For months, Allied planners had envisioned this day with precision, how the landing crafts would hit the shore, how the airborne troops would descend in the darkness, how the naval guns would silence every point of resistance. But Sicily, ancient and unpredictable, had its own intentions. The winds shifted, the currents tugged at the boats, paratroopers descended in scattered patterns, some miles from where they were meant to land. Yet the will of the invasion remained unbroken. Tens of thousands of soldiers poured ashore in the first hours, climbing over wreckage, pushing through water that surged around their waists, and scanning the ridgelines for the first German shells that could come at any moment. They knew the enemy was somewhere ahead, concealed in the folds of the landscape. What they did not know was how fiercely the defenders would fight, or how many unexpected obstacles would rise out of the dust before the battle for the island reached its end. The first German counterattacks did not arrive in massive waves. They emerged suddenly, sharply, like a blade flashing out of nowhere. Tanks rolled down narrow roads that twisted between olive groves and dry stone walls, their engines roaring in the morning heat. Infantry units, well-trained and fiercely loyal, moved with purpose, some to hold the high ground, others to strike at the vulnerable flanks of the Allied beachheads. The Americans and British pushing inland found themselves tested, not by huge numbers, but by a style of fighting that used every meter of the terrain with ruthless intelligence. On several occasions, Axis armor punched dangerously close to the sea, threatening to divide the Allied forces before they could establish a proper line of communication. These moments transformed the landing from a bold gamble into a razor-edge crisis. But each time, the thunder of the Allied fleet responded with terrifying power. Battleships anchored offshore unleashed shells the size of small trees, which tore into ridges where German guns had moments earlier been firing. Pilots flying overhead saw plumes of white smoke rising from those blasts like volcanic eruptions, each one a reminder that the Allies now possessed an overwhelming destructive range their enemies could no longer match. Even so, the defenders adapted. Columns shifted at night, artillery positions relocated before dawn, and the roads quickly became traps for anyone who moved without caution. This tug-of-war unfolded under a sky that did not belong to either side. The Luftwaffe, though battered by years of attrition, still tried to contest the air. German pilots flew missions that demanded courage beyond logic. Many planes were outdated, their engines tired, their ammunition limited. But the pilots still rose into the sky, climbing toward formations of Allied bombers that filled the horizon like migrating iron birds. Every pass they made cost them dearly. Some returned trailing smoke. Others never returned at all. The Allies acknowledged their skill, even as they pushed them back with overwhelming force. But the skies held another danger, one from the attackers themselves. Allied aircraft, especially during night operations, struggled to distinguish friend from foe. Confusion in the darkness, miscommunication over radio channels, and the frantic pace of the operation resulted in tragic friendly fire incidents that left commanders shaken. These mistakes led to rapid changes in Allied planning, new identification patterns, improved communications, stricter flight protocols. War was teaching them lessons at a brutal pace, and though Sicily offered no mercy, the Allies were determined to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. Yet, as difficult as the battlefield was, the tensions within the Allied command were often just as intense. Generals who shared the same ultimate goal did not always share the same vision of how to achieve it. British units fought toward the eastern end of the island, near Catania, where the terrain narrowed and the defense stiffened. American forces, advancing across broader, more open ground, sought opportunities to outmaneuver the defenders and perhaps cut off their retreat. Each side viewed its progress through a different lens, one of caution and deliberate movement, the other of aggressive momentum. Personalities clashed. Accusations of favoritism and unequal strategic priority circulated among officers. Rumors about who would lead the final breakthrough reached all the way up the chain of command. These disputes could have fractured a less resilient force, but Allied leadership understood that if division took root at the top, it would erode the men on the ground. Adjustments were made, responsibilities shuffled, and the overall strategy realigned so that neither the British nor the Americans felt overshadowed. The result was not perfect harmony, but a working balance, enough to keep the advance unified, even when tempers flared behind closed doors. In contrast, the Axis command underwent a transformation driven not by ambition but by survival. When German officers arrived from mainland Italy, they immediately recognized the situation. Sicily could not be saved. The island's geography, the Allies' naval dominance, and the pressure from the air meant the question was no longer how to win, but how long they could delay defeat, without losing their best troops. These officers restructured the defense with remarkable efficiency. Rather than exhausting themselves in hopeless stands, they adopted a fighting withdrawal. They used the mountains, valleys, and tight coastal roads as natural force multipliers. They mined paths, fortified villages, and mounted quick strikes designed to stall the Allied advance while revealing little about their long-term intentions. The goal was simple: buy time. Every hour the Allies spent overcoming a ridge or clearing a town was another hour in which German units could slip across the Strait of Messina into mainland Italy. This strategy displayed a harsh clarity. The island itself could be sacrificed, but the soldiers could not. And so, the defensive line did not collapse. It receded, carefully, deliberately, like a curtain being pulled back one fold at a time. The arrival of elite divisions only sharpened this method of resistance. Their discipline elevated the entire Axis withdrawal into something that resembled a controlled, calculated performance rather than a retreat. They counterattacked when necessary to create breathing room, then vanished into the next line of defense before the Allies could strike back. Towns changed hands multiple times. Hilltops that one side thought secure at dusk could be contested again by dawn. This constant motion turned Sicily into a maze, where victory felt attainable but always distant. Allied soldiers advancing through villages found the ruins strangely quiet, only to face sudden rifle fire from windows that had appeared deserted moments earlier. Nothing moved without scrutiny. Nothing was safe until it had been cleared twice. And every step forward raised the same question: where had the defenders gone, and where would they re-emerge? Despite all of these obstacles, the Allied advance pressed onward, driven by momentum, pressure from higher command, and the belief that Sicily could serve as the key to the next phase of the war. Supplies flowed constantly from ships offshore. Airfields quickly expanded near captured towns. Engineers built roads where none had existed, moving earth and stone under the scorching sun. Slowly, the invasion gathered speed. The Germans noticed. They knew time was running out. As August approached, the final stage of the campaign began. Axis forces fell back toward their last major defensive lines near Messina, where evacuation routes to mainland Italy awaited. The Allies, aware of what the Germans intended, tried desperately to seal the trap. They intensified their attacks, hoping to catch enemy units before they disappeared across the narrow strait. But the defenders' discipline, combined with the natural barriers of the terrain, frustrated many of these attempts. Convoys slipped across under cover of darkness, shielded by anti-aircraft guns, smoke, and the narrow geography of the waterway. In these final days, the battle was no longer about controlling Sicily. It was about denying the enemy the chance to escape. And yet, despite all the Allies' efforts, the Germans executed one of the most skillful evacuations of the entire war, preserving tens of thousands of troops who would soon fight again on the Italian mainland. By the time the last Axis units departed from the island, Sicily had been carved by weeks of relentless battle. Lines had shifted so often that maps struggled to keep up. The Allies had gained a foothold in Europe, but they had also gained something else: experience. The mistakes, miscommunications, and lessons learned would shape future operations. New identification markings for aircraft, revised airborne strategies, improved coordination between land and sea forces, and better communication protocols became permanent parts of the Allied playbook. Sicily had not just been a conquest, it had been a classroom. And as the dust settled on the island's rocky hills, both sides knew that the war had reached a new phase. The Allies looked toward the Italian mainland, aware that their momentum came with a price. The Axis, reorganizing their rescued troops just across the water, prepared for the next chapter with grim determination. Sicily was the beginning of something larger, something harsher, something that would stretch across mountains, rivers, and cities on the European continent. The campaign was over, but the consequences of those 38 days would ripple far beyond the island's shores, shaping decisions, strategies, and hopes for the remainder of the war. The fall of Sicily did not end the storm of 1943. It only redirected it toward a new shore. As August faded, the rumble of artillery grew quieter on the island, but across the narrow strait, Italy braced for a transformation no less violent than the battles that had just scarred its southern hills. On the night the last German units slipped away from Messina, Allied observers scanning the dark water understood that the next chapter would unfold on the Italian mainland itself. For them, Sicily had been the opening act, a brutal introduction to mountain warfare, to the strengths and weaknesses of combined operations, and to the tangled realities of coalition fighting. Now, with the island secure, the question hanging over every headquarters in London, Washington, and North Africa was simple. How fast could this momentum be pushed into the heart of Europe? Political winds shifted almost immediately. The collapse of Mussolini's regime, triggered in part by the shock of the Sicilian defeat, sent tremors through the entire Axis alliance. Italy, once a proud partner of Germany, now staggered between loyalty and surrender. The Allies, sensing opportunity, demanded unconditional capitulation, knowing that if Italy's government fell into their hands, the Germans would be forced to stretch their shrinking armies even thinner. But Italy hesitated, paralyzed by fear of German retaliation and uncertainty about Allied intentions. This hesitation created a vacuum, and into that vacuum marched the Wehrmacht. When the first Allied landing crafts approached the Calabrian coast on September 3rd, the resistance they encountered was strangely thin. The defenders had not abandoned Italy, but they had reorganized it into a trap. The Germans had no intention of fighting a decisive battle at the shoreline. They understood that the geography of the Italian peninsula, its ridges, its narrow passes, its twisting roads, its sudden cliffs, was the perfect environment for a long, grinding defense. Instead of contesting the beaches, they withdrew inland, aiming to force the Allies into a war of exhaustion. And so, the initial landings felt almost too easy. Soldiers who had expected a repeat of Sicily found empty farmhouses, abandoned trenches, and roads that wound upward into quiet hills. But the quiet was deceptive. The Germans were not fleeing. They were preparing. Behind these calm landscapes, entire divisions repositioned along the mountain barriers that formed natural defensive belts across the country. The Allies pushed deeper into Calabria with optimism, believing that perhaps Italy's surrender might bring a rapid collapse of resistance. But optimism in war is fragile. Within weeks, German forces moved swiftly to disarm the Italian army, after the new government finally agreed to join the Allies. Italian soldiers, stunned and confused, offered little resistance. Some tried to hide. Others attempted to join the Allies. Many were forced into prisoner columns marching north under German guard. Italy's surrender had not created an open road for the Allies. It had created a vacuum that Germany filled with alarming speed. Military transports poured down from the north, racing to secure critical cities, bridges, and mountain passes before Allied divisions could reach them. The Germans fought as though the fate of their entire southern front depended on every minute they could gain. And in many ways, it did. The terrain now became as powerful an opponent as the soldiers defending it. The slopes rose steeply from the coastal plains, forcing infantrymen to climb under the glare of snipers hidden in ruined farmhouses or behind stone walls older than most nations. Roads that looked manageable on maps turned into endless zigzags where even a single destroyed vehicle could halt an entire battalion. Rivers swollen by autumn rains cut across the landscape like natural trenches. The deeper the Allies advanced, the clearer it became why the Germans had chosen to fight here. Every hill was a fortress. Every village was a vantage point. Every bend in the road concealed a machine gun nest or an anti-tank gun positioned with surgical precision. And behind all these obstacles lay the Germans' greatest barrier, the Gustav Line. From the very beginning, Allied commanders knew this line would be the most formidable defensive position they had faced in the war so far. Anchored by Monte Cassino, an ancient, mountaintop abbey overlooking a winding river valley. The Gustav Line was not just a single line of trenches. It was a layered system of bunkers, dugouts, gun emplacements, and minefields, reinforced by the natural terrain. German engineers had studied the ground carefully, identifying every advantage the hills offered. They knew the Allies depended on armor, mobility, and air power. On this terrain, none of those strengths applied. Tanks could barely maneuver on the narrow roads, artillery pieces struggled to find good firing positions, and clouds, fog, and steep valleys limited the effectiveness of Allied aircraft. The Allies understood that the Germans had turned Italy into a long, narrow anvil, and they were being forced to hammer their way north, one painful strike at a time. The first clashes near the defensive lines shocked the advancing forces. Units expecting moderate resistance found themselves pinned down for hours by mortar fire coming from positions they could barely see. German sharpshooters used the high ridges to devastating effect. Even when Allied troops captured a hill, they often discovered that the next ridge was even higher, giving the enemy another perfect line of fire. Engineers struggled to clear mines under constant artillery bursts. Medics worked along ravines and dry creek beds where wounded men crawled, seeking cover from sniper fire. In some places, the rain softened the soil into thick mud that clung to boots and wheels, slowing every movement and turning supply runs into logistical nightmares. The winter that followed added another layer of misery. Snow fell on the mountains, fog thickened in the valleys, and men who had fought in desert heat months earlier now fought against cold that froze weapons overnight. In the midst of this grinding campaign, Germany's strategic balance began to shift dramatically. Far from the Italian front, on the endless plains of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Kursk had just exploded in July, a gigantic clash of armor and willpower that dwarfed anything the Allies had yet seen. While the Allies fought for Sicily, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army hurled thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft against each other around the Kursk salient. Hitler had believed that this battle, Operation Citadel, would give him the decisive blow he needed to regain control of the Eastern Front. Instead, the delays he imposed, combined with Soviet intelligence and preparation, turned the offensive into a disaster. When the Red Army switched to a massive counteroffensive, German divisions were pushed back relentlessly. The failure at Kursk meant Germany would never again regain the strategic initiative in the east. And as the Soviets surged forward, the Germans had to divert precious reinforcements away from Italy, ensuring that the Allied struggle on the peninsula, though slow and bloody, was also draining the enemy's already stretched resources. The news of Kursk filtered slowly to the men fighting in Italy. But even without understanding the full situation, they could feel change in the air. German units that had fought relentlessly for every hillside now seemed more interested in delaying actions than in decisive stands. They laid mines, blew bridges, collapsed tunnels, and then withdrew to new positions. The Allies followed, but each advance cost them dearly. Battles for small villages, isolated farmhouses, and nameless ridges stretched for days. Soldiers described Italy as a vertical battlefield, one where every yard forward was another yard upward. Yet amid the hardship, the Allies learned. The harsh lessons of Sicily and southern Italy sharpened their coordination. Radio networks improved. Air support procedures were refined. Commanders adjusted their strategies, and combined arms tactics became more polished with every engagement. Most importantly, the Allied forces began to understand that the campaign in Italy was not simply a march north. It was a test of endurance, a constant battle against the land itself, and a fight against an enemy who used every contour of that land to maximum effect. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Europe was changing rapidly. Italy's surrender created opportunities and complications. The German occupation of Rome and the northern provinces brought cruelty and fear to the civilian population, but it also sparked resistance movements across the country. Partisan groups formed in the mountains, sabotaging German supply lines and providing intelligence to the Allies. Every act of resistance came with terrible risks. Reprisals were swift and brutal, but the movement grew anyway. As the Italian campaign dragged on, these scattered fighters would become an increasingly important force, contributing in ways that could not always be measured in maps or casualty reports, but which shaped the moral and logistical dimensions of the war. Beyond Italy, the war continued to expand. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, targeting German industry and infrastructure with increasing precision. While the Germans fought desperately to defend their cities, their resources were being drained by the need to repair factories, replace lost aircraft, and rebuild shattered supply lines. These strains, combined with the losses in Russia, forced German commanders to make difficult decisions about where to deploy their remaining strength. Italy, though strategically important, could not receive unlimited reinforcements. Every division sent south was a division not available to stop the Soviets in the east or to prepare for the Allied cross-channel invasion that everyone knew was coming. Despite all this, the German defense in Italy remained remarkably resilient. Their soldiers dug tunnels into slopes, built camouflaged bunkers, and created interlocking fields of fire designed to bleed the advancing Allied troops at every step. And bleed, they did. By the end of 1943, the Allies found themselves halted not far from the Gustav Line, staring up at mountains that seemed impossible to conquer and aware that every mile ahead would cost more than the mile behind. Yet they also knew that stopping now was impossible. The road north was the only road forward, and on it lay Rome, the Po Valley, and finally the passes that led toward the heart of Europe. Even as both sides braced for the battles to come, the larger context of the war made one thing clear. Germany was slowly losing its ability to fight everywhere at once. The Allies, despite setbacks and heavy losses, were tightening the noose from all directions. The Italian campaign was just one arm of that tightening grip, but an arm that was growing stronger with every step the Allies took. And as 1943 neared its end, the stage was set for the confrontations of 1944, confrontations that would determine whether the German strategy of delay, entrenchment, and stubborn defense could slow the Allied advance long enough for some miracle to alter the war's course. As the Allies struggled upward through the punishing terrain of southern Italy, The German High Command carefully watched each development, measuring every Allied gain against a shrinking reserve of men and materials. Though battered at Kursk and slowed across the Mediterranean front, the Wehrmacht command structure remained dangerously efficient, and its ability to orchestrate delays across multiple fronts continued to challenge Allied planners. General Albert Kesselring, charged with the defense of Italy, saw the peninsula not as a doomed battlefield, but as a long, narrow opportunity to drain Allied strength. He argued to Hitler that Italy could be held indefinitely if they used the terrain correctly. The Führer, desperate for any place where German arms could still force the Allies into costly attritional warfare, agreed. So while the Allies imagined that capturing Sicily and forcing Italy out of the war would lead to a rapid collapse of Axis resistance in the south, the Germans envisioned something entirely different. A grinding campaign that would tie down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, slow their timetable, and possibly delay the invasion of France. To accomplish this, the Germans built not one defensive line, but a series, stretching like ribs across the spine of the peninsula. The Gustav Line was the centerpiece, but it was only one of several layered belts designed to force the Allies into repeated cycles of attack, exhaustion, regrouping, and attack again. As autumn crept in, this defensive network began to reveal its deadly potential. When Allied troops pushed toward the Volturno River, the last barrier before the southern approach to the Gustav Line, they met an increasingly organized enemy. German engineers blew up bridges as soon as Allied forces approached, leaving advancing troops to build makeshift replacements under continuous artillery fire. Infantry crossing in small boats found themselves exposed to machine gun bursts from concealed positions carved into cliffs. When the Allies finally captured a town or hillside, they often found nothing left but rubble, German rearguards having detonated charges that turned entire streets into fields of jagged stone. Still, Allied morale held firm. Many soldiers believed that they were only weeks away from Rome, that the German lines would crack once the winter rains began. But winter did not weaken the defenders. It strengthened them. Cold fog settled into the valleys, masking German movements and turning every hillside into a ghostly silhouette where shapes flickered in and out of visibility. Snow accumulated on high ridges, camouflaging German gun emplacements dug deep into the frozen earth. The mountains themselves became hostile. Men slipped on icy slopes, supply trucks slid into ravines, and artillery shells often detonated unpredictably on rocky ground, sending lethal fragments at twisting angles. Yet even under these harsh conditions, German troops seemed to fight with renewed determination. Many were experienced veterans withdrawn from the Eastern Front, where they had learned the art of defensive warfare under conditions far worse than Italy's. To them, mountain fighting was familiar, and they used every inch of elevation to their advantage. As the Allies advanced closer to the Gustav Line, they encountered the first real symbol of the defensive monster before them, the town of San Pietro. Infine, nestled between steep ridges and overlooked by fortified hills, San Pietro became the stage for one of the most intense and defining battles of the Italian campaign. Here, the terrain trapped advancing Allied formations in narrow approaches, where German machine gun fire cut down men before they could even reach the outer streets. American troops from the 36th Infantry Division fought through vineyards, orchards, and shattered stone houses in an ordeal so brutal that filmmaker John Huston, who documented the battle, described it as a place where death was everywhere and moved in silence. By the time the town was finally taken, little remained standing. Roofs had collapsed, walls were riddled with bullet holes, and entire sections of the village had been pulverized by Allied artillery. Yet even this victory felt hollow, for above San Pietro loomed the next ridge, still in German hands, still shielded behind layers of bunkers and barbed wire. The slow pace of the Italian campaign bred frustration at Allied headquarters. Generals questioned whether the mountainous terrain truly required such heavy casualties, or whether German skill was being overestimated. Some commanders believed that a bold amphibious operation behind enemy lines might crack the stalemate, cutting off German units and unlocking the road to Rome. Thus was born the plan for Operation Shingle, the landings at Anzio. Its goal was simple: land a force on the coast behind the Gustav Line, threaten German supply routes, draw divisions away from the front, and collapse the German defense from the rear. But the execution was anything but simple. On paper, Anzio had the potential to change the entire course of the campaign. If Allied troops moved quickly inland, they could seize the Alban Hills, cutting several key highways and trapping German forces between two Allied fronts. But caution and conflicting orders sapped the energy of the landing almost immediately. Major General John Lucas, commanding the operation, feared that a rapid advance would overextend his men. Instead of striking directly at the hills, he consolidated his position near the beach, giving the Germans precious time to react. And react they did. Within days, Kesselring gathered every available unit, deploying them in a tightening ring around the shallow Allied perimeter. The land that had been chosen for its flatness, perfect for a swift advance, now became a flat killing field where artillery fire rained down from the surrounding high ground with relentless accuracy. The fighting at Anzio devolved into trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. Shells exploded day and night, reducing farmhouses and fields to craters filled with water and mud. Soldiers huddled in shallow dugouts, waiting for the next bombardment. Hospitals overflowed with wounded, supply lines were constantly threatened, and morale wavered under the strain of constant shelling. German counterattacks came in waves, sometimes at dawn, sometimes under the eerie glow of flares at night. Each assault pushed closer to the Allied lines, threatening to drive the invaders back into the sea. Only with immense effort and the arrival of reinforcements did the Allies manage to hold the beachhead. But holding was not enough. They had wanted a breakthrough, a strategic victory. Instead, they found themselves locked in a stalemate almost as painful as the one they had tried to bypass. Meanwhile, as the Italian front consumed Allied manpower and strategic focus, the broader war raged on with accelerating violence. The Eastern Front burned like a fuse across thousands of miles. The Wehrmacht, reeling from the massive defeats around Kursk, struggled to contain the Red Army's relentless push westward. Entire German divisions were destroyed or forced into chaotic retreats, leaving behind equipment and wounded men in scenes of collapse not seen since Stalingrad. The Soviets recaptured key cities: Belgorod, Oriel, Kharkiv, each victory marked by artillery salutes echoing across Moscow. The momentum of the war had shifted decisively. Germany no longer dictated the pace. It reacted, withdrew, and endured. This shift reverberated through every theater. On the Atlantic, the U-boat fleet suffered catastrophic losses as Allied radar, depth charges, and long-range aircraft made the oceans increasingly deadly for German submarines. In the skies above Europe, Allied bombers pressed deeper into the heart of the Reich, attempting to cripple its industrial capacity. But while the bombing campaign inflicted immense destruction and killed tens of thousands of civilians, it also revealed the staggering resilience of German industry and the terrifying cost borne by Allied crews. Missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Münster became synonymous with loss. Entire bomber groups vanished in minutes under the combined fury of flak and fighter attacks. Survivors spoke of sky-wide battlefields where explosions were so constant that the horizon dissolved into smoke and fire. Yet even with these sacrifices, German production continued. Aircraft factories repaired damage, ball-bearing facilities moved underground, and the Luftwaffe, though bleeding pilots, continued to contest the skies. But perhaps the darkest and most horrifying chapter of 1943 unfolded not on battlefields, but in the shadows where the machinery of genocide operated. Action Reinhard reached its peak. In the death camps of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, hundreds of thousands were murdered in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Transports arrived daily, packed with men, women, and children from ghettos across Eastern Europe. Most never learned where they had been taken until moments before their death. Their belongings were confiscated, their hair cut, their valuables sorted and shipped to Germany. The efficiency of this killing system was chilling, its cruelty boundless. But within this horror, acts of defiance emerged that burned with extraordinary courage. Prisoners at Treblinka and Sobibor staged daring uprisings, attacking guards, seizing weapons, and breaking through fences in desperate attempts for freedom. Though most participants were hunted down and killed, their resistance became a symbol of human courage in the face of unspeakable evil. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, erupting in April 1943, became the most iconic act of Jewish resistance. Knowing they faced near certain death, the fighters of the ghetto, armed with smuggled pistols, homemade explosives, and a handful of rifles, held off thousands of German soldiers for nearly a month. Their determination shocked even the German officers, who expected an easy, one-day operation. Flames engulfed entire streets as the SS burned the ghetto building by building to flush out the defenders. When the uprising was finally crushed, little remained but smoldering ruins and scattered bodies. Yet the story of their resistance spread far beyond Warsaw, echoing through occupied Europe as a testament to human dignity under impossible conditions. Back in Italy, winter turned slowly toward spring. The Allies, having endured months of attrition, regrouped for the operation that would finally shatter the Gustav Line and open the road to Rome. But between them and the breakthrough stood Monte Cassino, a mountain fortress whose silhouette had become the symbol of the entire campaign. The abbey at its summit, a 1,000-year-old monument to European culture, dominated the battlefield like a stone sentinel. German troops of the elite paratrooper divisions manned the slopes below, turning the mountain into a near-impenetrable ring of fire. Every Allied attempt to break through the surrounding valleys ended in bloody failure. The first battle stalled under ferocious German resistance. The second drowned in mud and artillery bursts. The third ended amid bitter controversy when the Allies bombed the ancient abbey, mistakenly believing the Germans had occupied it. The fourth and final assault would require a massive multinational effort, including Polish, British, French, Moroccan, American, and New Zealand forces, a coalition as diverse as the World War itself. And yet, even as these armies prepared for the culmination of their struggle in Italy, the broader narrative of 1943 was already clear. The Axis was losing power, losing ground, losing the capacity to fight a long war. But the cost to the Allies was staggering. Victory came not with sweeping triumphs, but with slow, grinding effort, foot by foot, hill by hill, corpse by corpse. By the time the year drew to a close, millions were dead across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Cities burned. Families were torn apart, front lines stretched across continents, and still, the war showed no sign of ending soon. The Allies had momentum, but victory remained distant. Germany had lost its strategic initiative, but its armies still fought with brutal efficiency and ruthless determination. As 1943 bled into 1944, the world stood on the threshold of the war's most decisive year. One that would bring D-Day, the collapse of Nazi defenses in the East, the intensification of bombing campaigns, and the acceleration of genocide. But for now, the story paused on a battlefield of mud, stone, and blood, Italy, where Allied soldiers stared toward the north, knowing that behind every ridge waited another line of fire, another trench, another grave. The slow grind through Italy continued to shape the Allied war effort far more than any general had expected, and while armies battled across mountains and valleys, The political landscape of Europe trembled under the weight of changing fortunes. The fall of Mussolini, a moment that seemed to promise a rapid collapse of Italian resistance, had instead opened a new set of complications. The new Italian government sought an armistice with the Allies, hoping to escape the war, but the Germans reacted instantly, seizing key cities, disarming Italian troops, and fortifying the peninsula with chilling efficiency. Entire Italian divisions surrendered without firing a shot, while others resisted briefly, only to be overwhelmed by German armor. In the space of a few days, Italy transformed from an Axis ally into a battlefield occupied almost entirely by German forces. For the Allies, this meant that the strategic benefits they had hoped for, Wehrmacht withdrawals, the opening of supply routes, or mass defections, did not materialize. Instead, they faced the formidable German 10th Army, under Kesselring, now dug in, reinforced, and determined to make the Allies pay for every mile they advanced. Mountains that had once separated sleepy towns became ramparts of a defensive network stretching from sea to sea, and rivers once known for their quiet beauty became muddy, swollen barriers behind which enemy troops waited with machine guns and mortar teams. Even as the Allies captured key points like Naples and secured harbors that would feed the long campaign ahead, they realized the magnitude of the challenge. The German command intended to use Italy as a shield, delaying the Allied timetable and forcing them to invest massive resources in a campaign that yielded slow gains. While the Allies fought across the boot of Italy, across the sea, the situation in the Soviet Union told a different, but equally dramatic story. The Red Army, having halted and then reversed the German offensive at Kursk, moved with new confidence across the vast eastern plains. Their counter-offensives swept through towns that had lived under occupation for more than 2 years, liberating cities that had been reduced to charred shells. Each advance grew sharper, faster, more coordinated. Soviet infantry moved with hardened discipline. Tank brigades surged forward with relentless momentum. Artillery barrages thundered across the horizon in orchestrated waves that the Germans struggled to answer. Yet Soviet victories came at staggering costs. The battles of 1943 were among the deadliest in the war's history. Entire formations vanished in the smoke of the steppe. Towns like Kharkiv changed hands multiple times, each transition marked by casualties that scarred both armies. German commanders, skilled in mobile defense, executed delaying actions that cost the Red Army time and blood. Even in retreat, the Wehrmacht inflicted awful losses. But the larger truth had shifted. Germany could no longer replace its losses, while the Soviet war machine, supported by American trucks, British radios, Mongolian horses, and factories beyond the Urals, accelerated in power. Every mile gained brought the Red Army closer to the borders of Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Stalin, once forced into desperate defensive measures, now stood poised to reclaim territories lost in 1941 and push beyond them into Eastern Europe. In the skies above the continent, the struggle for air supremacy intensified. The Allied bombing campaign, violent, costly, and morally complex, was an experiment in a new form of warfare, one that aimed to break the enemy's industrial heart from thousands of meters above. Missions against Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Berlin filled the summer and fall with smoke, fire, and destruction. Yet the bombers themselves paid a terrible price. Crews climbed into their flying fortresses, knowing that each mission carried a high chance of death or imprisonment. They watched formation mates explode in midair, spinning down into fields or crashing into cities they never intended to attack. They navigated through black flak clouds so dense they resembled storm fronts, each burst marking a point where metal fragments sliced through aluminum skin and flesh alike. The psychological toll was enormous. Some crews returned shaking, some never spoke again of what they had witnessed, and some cracked entirely. Still, the missions continued, driven by the belief that weakening Germany's industrial base would shorten the war. Factories rebuilt, switching to dispersed underground locations. Railway networks rerouted through forests. Armament plants adopted night shifts and improvised replacements like porcelain ball bearings. Germany's resilience astonished Allied planners who realized that bombing alone, however devastating, could not crush the Reich. But the cumulative pressure weakened the Luftwaffe's ability to respond. Young German pilots now entered combat with only a fraction of the training earlier generations had received. They faced Allied escort fighters such as the long-range P-51 Mustang, machines that could accompany bombers deep into Germany, pursuing enemy fighters almost to their own airfields. Even as German factories produced aircraft in record numbers, the pilots to fly them were dwindling. Veteran aces, once the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were increasingly killed or overwhelmed by sheer numerical disadvantage. What had begun as a defensive struggle for Germany now turned into a desperate attempt to slow an inevitable tide. Meanwhile, the brutality of Nazi occupation deepened across Europe. The German state clung to its ideology of racial domination, even as its armies faltered. 1943 became the year when mass murder reached its deadliest tempo. The liquidation of ghettos accelerated, transports to Auschwitz increased, entire Jewish communities vanished into the machinery of genocide. Yet even amid this dark landscape, resistance grew. Partisan movements in Yugoslavia, Poland, Belarus, and Greece mounted increasingly coordinated guerrilla campaigns. They sabotaged rail lines, ambushed German patrols, destroyed supply depots, and provided crucial intelligence to the Allies. Their courage came at a horrific cost. Reprisals often wiped out entire villages, but the resistance networks persisted, weaving underground channels of communication and hope in territories ruled by fear. Back in Italy, the campaign reached one of its most grueling phases. The Gustav Line, anchored by Monte Cassino, stood like a stone wall across the center of the country. Attempts to break it had already drained Allied formations of thousands of men. Troops who had landed fresh, optimistic, and ready to push toward Rome now huddled in dripping foxholes, exhausted by mud, cold, and constant fire. Commanders debated new approaches. Should they launch another frontal assault? Should they attempt a larger flanking movement? Should they pour more troops into Anzio and try to break out from the beachhead? Every option carried enormous risks. Yet doing nothing was costlier still, as the winter rains washed away hope and turned every valley into a bog. In London and Washington, political pressure mounted. The public wanted progress. Leaders wanted Rome. Soldiers wanted relief. When spring finally returned, it brought with it renewed resolve. The Allies prepared a massive assault combining infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. Polish, French, Moroccan, British, Indian, American, and New Zealand troops all readied themselves for the battle that would define the campaign. The abbey atop Monte Cassino, its ancient walls now reduced to rubble from earlier bombings, sat at the center of the storm. German paratroopers continued to hold the slopes below, protected by caves, tunnels, and camouflaged positions, invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The final assault began with a thunderous barrage, shaking the mountain and echoing for miles. Infantry climbed upward under machine gun fire that poured through narrow defiles. Casualties mounted, but slowly, painfully, the line began to bend. Days of brutal combat followed. Entire units were shattered. The Polish II Corps, determined to take the mountain, suffered heavy losses but fought with unmatched resolve. And finally, after months of bloodshed, Monte Cassino fell. It was not just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic triumph. The Gustav Line collapsed. German forces withdrew northward. Rome lay ahead. As Allied troops marched into the Italian capital in June 1944, the world briefly paused to celebrate. But generals knew the truth. Rome's fall was not the end. It was simply a milestone on a long, dangerous road. Germany still held strong defensive lines farther north. The war in Italy was far from over, And in the broader conflict, the most decisive battles were still to come. The landings in Normandy, the Soviet offensives that would tear into the heart of Eastern Europe, and the final struggle across Germany itself. For now, though, the story of 1943 and early 1944 remained one of grinding endurance. A year defined not by sweeping victories but by slow, punishing battles whose impact rippled across continents. Every front, every river, every mountain became a test of willpower. The Allies had gained the upper hand, but the cost had been immense, and the final victory remained uncertain. Soldiers on every front looked toward the future with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that the world around them was changing faster than anyone could fully grasp, and that the next year would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future of entire nations. As 1943 unfolded into its later months, the war entered a phase where every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Allies had made undeniable progress, but nothing came easily. Every gain required enormous sacrifice, and every setback forced painful reassessments. In London and Washington, political leaders faced the constant pressure of balancing military strategy with public expectation. Citizens wanted victory, wanted reassurance that their sacrifices meant something, wanted proof that the tide was turning decisively. Newspapers printed encouraging headlines, but military planners knew the truth. Germany, though wounded, remained a formidable enemy. Its armies still held vast territories, its factories still produced weapons at alarming speed, and its defensive lines, in France, in Italy, and Eastern Europe, were thick with mines, artillery, and some of the most disciplined troops the world had ever seen. If the Allies were to achieve the breakthrough they desperately needed, they would have to coordinate on a scale never attempted before, merging air, land, and sea power into a single, crushing blow. The seeds of Normandy were already being planted in war rooms, on maps spread across oak tables, in whispered conferences in London basements and Washington offices. Yet while the Western Allies planned their great invasion, it was the Soviet Union that bore the brunt of the fighting. After the triumph at Kursk, the Red Army surged forward with growing confidence, reclaiming territory that had been under German occupation for nearly 2 years. Towns like Smolensk, Chernihiv, and Poltava, once symbols of German dominance, now became reminders of Germany's rapid retreat. Burned-out tanks littered fields where thousands had fallen. Villages emptied by deportation or starvation stood silent, their surviving inhabitants emerging cautiously as Soviet soldiers passed through. For many, liberation came with mixed emotions. Relief at the end of occupation, sorrow at the loss of family, fear at what the future might hold. The Red Army advanced with both triumph and tragedy in its wake. Its soldiers fought ferociously, driven by a mix of patriotism, vengeance, and the desperate desire to finally see the war end. But the cost was enormous. Soviet commanders often committed entire divisions to attacks that left tens of thousands dead within days. At times, soldiers advanced through fields so thick with bodies that commanders could not find clear ground to build new defensive lines. Yet they continued, propelled by the knowledge that stopping meant giving the enemy time to regroup. And no one, neither Stalin nor Zhukov, nor the exhausted infantry, wanted to surrender momentum now that it was finally on their side. Meanwhile, in Germany, the effects of Allied bombing and military defeats rippled through society. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had vanished under firestorms that consumed oxygen and left survivors fleeing through streets filled with burning debris. Factories shifted underground, families hid in basements every night, and civilians began to wonder whether the promises of victory that had once energized the nation were nothing more than illusions. Nazi propaganda continued to insist that Germany would triumph, that secret weapons were coming, that betrayal alone had caused losses on the Eastern Front. But ordinary Germans began to see the truth in the devastation around them. Food grew scarce, fuel rationing increased, and the once celebrated Luftwaffe found itself increasingly unable to protect the homeland. German pilots who had once dominated the skies over Europe were now fighting desperate defensive battles with dwindling resources. Many of the aces who had secured victory after victory in 1940 and 1941 were gone, killed, injured, or too exhausted to continue fighting at the same pace. Fresh pilots arrived with minimal training, thrown into combat against seasoned Allied crews. Some lasted only minutes before being shot down. The Luftwaffe's strength, once the pride of Germany, was beginning to crack. But even as Germany weakened, the regime's brutality intensified. 1943 marked not a reduction, but an expansion of genocide. Entire Jewish communities that had survived earlier deportations were now hunted relentlessly. Transports to Auschwitz increased, and the camp's killing machinery ran at full capacity. The SS accelerated the liquidation of ghettos, deporting tens of thousands at a time in sealed cattle cars, where many died before reaching their intended place of execution. Roma families, Polish civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, millions remained caught in the machinery of Nazi violence. And yet, resistance grew. The uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor sent shockwaves through the German command. At Treblinka, prisoners rose up with a ferocity born of desperation, overpowering guards and burning parts of the camp. At Sobibor, a meticulously planned revolt led by Soviet Jewish prisoners stunned the Germans. The uprising not only allowed escapes, it forced the SS to shut down the camp entirely. It was one of the few moments in the entire war when a Nazi killing center ceased to exist because of the very people it was designed to murder. And then came the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a moment that electrified the world even as it ended in tragedy. The sight of Jewish fighters resisting the heavily armed SS for almost a month, fighting in tunnels, attics, and barricaded streets, became a symbol of courage that would echo through generations. These acts of resistance did not stop the Holocaust, but they shattered the myth of Jewish passivity and proved that even in the darkest of circumstances, human dignity and defiance could survive. In the Mediterranean, the collapse of Mussolini's government had set Italy into chaos. After signing an armistice with the Allies, Italy had hoped the fighting would end. Instead, German troops swiftly occupied the country, disarmed Italian forces, and formed new defensive lines in the mountainous terrain. Italian civilians now found themselves caught between two armies. Some welcomed the Allies with open arms, desperate for liberation. Others feared that German reprisals would devastate their towns. The winter of 1943 was cold, brutal, and full of suffering. Entire villages fled into the hills to escape roundups. German units fighting retreat battles often took hostages or executed civilians accused of aiding partisans. The Italian resistance, formed from former soldiers, students, and ordinary citizens, began to build networks in the north. They carried out sabotage missions, ambushes, and intelligence-gathering operations that would become crucial in the years ahead. They fought in forests, barns, mountains, and cities, shadow soldiers in a fractured nation. Across the Atlantic, the United States continued its transformation into a wartime powerhouse. Its factories churned out tanks, bombers, rifles, ammunition, and uniforms at an unprecedented pace. Women filled assembly lines once occupied solely by men. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster. It became a cultural symbol of the home front's determination. African American workers, despite segregation and discrimination, played vital roles in war production, contributing to an industrial output that dwarfed anything the Axis could match. In every major city, the echoes of hammers, welding torches, and assembly machines filled the air. This enormous economic engine allowed the Allies to sustain losses that would have broken other nations. A B-17 shot down over Germany might be replaced within days. Tanks destroyed in Italy could be replaced by convoys arriving in Naples. The American war machine not only supplied its own forces but fed the armies of Britain, the Soviet Union, and countless smaller Allied nations. Lend-Lease trucks carried Soviet troops to Berlin. British forces fought with American-made aircraft. The global nature of American production became one of the decisive factors ensuring eventual Allied victory. But despite mounting Allied strength, Germany still held a formidable defensive advantage. Everywhere its troops withdrew, they left behind mines, booby traps, entrenched positions, and scorched earth destruction. In France, they strengthened the Atlantic Wall. Bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, and concrete fortifications stretched along the coastline from Norway to Spain. Hitler believed this defensive belt, if reinforced and properly manned, could repel any Allied landing. Rommel, now tasked with overseeing coastal defenses, worked tirelessly to improve fortifications. He toured beaches personally, ordering obstacles placed to tear apart landing craft, mines buried in sand dunes, and artillery concealed in cliffs. He warned Hitler that the Allies would strike in the west, and soon. He also insisted that armored divisions be stationed close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours. But he faced opposition from other German commanders, who believed the panzer divisions should be held inland, ready to maneuver once the Allies revealed their main landing site. These internal disagreements, which seemed like minor disputes at the time, would eventually play a crucial role in determining the outcome of the Normandy invasion. As 1943 drew to a close, every front of the war was tense, chaotic, and full of uncertainty. Victory appeared within reach for the Allies, but so did disaster. If the Normandy landings failed, the war could drag on for years. If the Soviets suffered another major setback, Germany might stabilize the Eastern Front. If Italy collapsed into deeper chaos, the campaign could bog down indefinitely. Yet for all the challenges, one truth had become unmistakable. Germany no longer controlled the momentum of the war. The initiative now lay firmly with the Allies. After years of defensive fighting, retreat, and desperation, the world had shifted. The Axis powers were no longer expanding. They were contracting, shrinking back toward their own borders. Their armies fought extraordinary defensive battles, but their resources dwindled. Their leadership made increasingly desperate decisions. Their people suffered shortages that grew worse with each passing month. The Allies, despite disagreements, despite heavy losses, despite setbacks, moved with the confidence of nations that now believed victory was not only possible, but inevitable. The stage was being set for the final confrontations of the war. The Red Army prepared to surge across Ukraine and into Poland. The Western Allies prepared to tear open Hitler's fortress Europe. Resistance movements across the continent waited for the signal to rise in support. The world stood at the edge of a decisive new chapter, one that would determine not only the outcome of the war, but the future shape of Europe, the fate of millions, and the course of history itself. As winter settled over Europe near the end of 1943, the entire war seemed to pause for breath, not in calm, but in the tense, heavy silence that comes before a storm. Every nation involved sensed that the coming year would decide everything. In Berlin, Hitler gathered his commanders and demanded miracles from armies that were already stretched thin. He insisted that new weapons, rockets, jets, improved submarines, would shift the balance back in Germany's favor, even though his officers knew that technology could not replace lost manpower, shattered divisions, or factories struggling under the weight of Allied bombing. In London, Churchill stared at maps marked with thousands of colored pins, each representing a unit, a ship, an air squadron, and he understood that the moment Britain had waited for since 1940 was approaching. The country that had once stood alone against the Axis was now preparing to return to the European continent with overwhelming force. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt coordinated economic and military strategy on a scale that surpassed every previous American conflict. Shipyards along the coasts roared with sound as workers hammered steel plates into place to build the vessels that would carry hundreds of thousands of soldiers to foreign shores. The United States, still a young nation in global politics, was now the arsenal not just of democracy, but of the entire Allied world. And far to the east, Stalin, hardened by years of relentless warfare, watched his armies push westward through snows that had buried countless soldiers of both sides. He knew that every mile his troops advanced would shape the post-war world as much as the war itself. On the Eastern Front, the German army endured one of the harshest winters it had faced, not because of weather, but because its long retreat had brought it into poorly prepared positions. Entire formations dug into frozen ground, their trenches half collapsed, and their boots soaked with melting snow that froze again each night. Supplies barely reached some sectors. Horses died from exhaustion. Soldiers used whatever scraps of cloth they could find to wrap their hands and feet. Even so, German discipline remained disturbingly strong. Officers demanded order. Every retreat was organized, every position abandoned only after precise calculations. In some sectors, soldiers built defensive lines under fire, laying mines in fields where their own comrades had fallen. They held river crossings until the last possible moment, then withdrew in darkness, leaving bridges rigged with explosives that collapsed just as Soviet tanks approached. But their resistance, skilled, determined, and often heroic, could not erase a fundamental truth. The Red Army had grown too powerful to stop. Soviet forces, for their part, moved with a momentum that seemed almost unstoppable. Their tanks rumbled forward across frozen ground, turrets covered in frost and mud. Infantry followed close behind, sometimes riding on the backs of armored vehicles, sometimes marching in long columns through burned-out fields. Artillery batteries, so numerous that their shells seemed to merge into a single earthquake-like roar, fired in coordinated patterns designed to crush any German attempt to counterattack. Supplies followed in endless streams, trucks loaded with ammunition, horses dragging sleds, men carrying crates on their shoulders. Units that had once lacked basic weapons now carried American-made radios, British medical kits, and rifles manufactured east of the Urals in cities that had become industrial fortresses. Each liberated town brought a mix of joy and sorrow. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars, their faces thin from hunger, their voices shaking from trauma. Soviet soldiers delivered bread, bandaged wounds, and reported the atrocities they found to their commanders. As the front advanced, corpses were discovered in ravines, mass graves uncovered near forests, and shattered ghettos revealed the full cruelty of German occupation. These discoveries deepened Soviet resolve. They no longer fought simply for survival. They fought for justice, for vengeance, for the chance to end the nightmare permanently. In Italy, 1943 bled into 1944 with a sense of grinding futility. The Allies had taken Naples, but Rome remained out of reach. The Gothic Line, the Gustav Line, the fortresses carved into cliffs and mountains, all of these became symbols of the German defensive genius at its peak. Every offensive seemed to collapse into stalled momentum and tragic losses. Rain turned valleys into swamps. Rivers flooded at the worst moments. Mountain passes became firing lanes for German machine gunners positioned with mathematical precision. Allied infantry units rotated through these killing grounds, each returning with fewer men than before. Morale trembled under the combined weight of fatigue and disappointment. Commanders argued over strategies. Some favored massive frontal assaults supported by air power. Others pushed for bold amphibious landings behind enemy lines. The eventual decision to land at Anzio, meant to outflank the German defenses and break through to Rome, produced initial excitement but soon devolved into another stalemate as the Germans reacted with incredible speed. They surrounded the beachhead, shelled it relentlessly, and forced the Allies into defensive positions that echoed the trench warfare of the previous World War. Many soldiers believed they had been sent into a trap. And yet, they held. Across the Channel from France, the British Isles transformed into one enormous staging ground. Entire counties filled with American troops practicing amphibious landings, air assaults, and nighttime navigation. Villages filled with the sounds of marching boots, jeep engines, and coded radio chatter. Military policemen managed convoys so long they stretched from city to city. Airfields once used by a few squadrons now hosted entire wings of bombers and fighters. Harbors brimmed with landing craft, destroyers, troop ships, and floating docks. All of Britain became a vast machine preparing for the greatest amphibious assault in human history. Yet secrecy remained absolute. Not even the soldiers knew their precise destination. Code names replaced locations, maps were hidden, letters home were censored. In London, war planners pored over weather charts and tide tables, calculating the exact conditions needed to storm the beaches of France. They debated moonlight levels for paratroopers, wind speed for gliders, and the depth of sandbanks that could trap landing craft. The success of the entire Western Front depended on these details, and every commander knew that a single error could doom thousands of men. They planned obsessively, knowing that once the first wave hit the beaches, chaos would replace order. Beyond the front lines, the civilian world continued to live in uncertainty. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, and the Balkans, the occupation dragged on with increasing brutality. Resistance fighters blew up railway tracks, assassinated officers, and smuggled intelligence to the Allies. These acts of defiance came at terrible cost. The German response to sabotage was swift and merciless. Entire towns faced reprisals. Families were torn apart by fear and suspicion, yet the resistance movements grew, linked by underground networks and supported by Allied supply drops. Many civilians who had once accepted occupation as an unfortunate reality now felt a changing tide. Rumors of Allied victories, Soviet advances, and German retreats spread with whispered excitement. Hope, a fragile, dangerous emotion, returned. Meanwhile, the Holocaust reached deeper into Europe. German authorities, desperate to complete their genocidal project before the war turned decisively against them, intensified deportations from Greece, Italy, France, and the remnants of Poland. Yet at the same time, acts of rescue grew more frequent. In Denmark, fishermen ferried thousands of Jews across narrow sea channels to Sweden. In Italy, villagers hid families in farmhouses and monasteries. In France, forged documents circulated through underground networks. Even in Germany, small acts of defiance, quiet warnings, forged papers, hidden rooms, saved lives. These stories, though overshadowed by the continent-wide darkness, revealed that humanity had not been extinguished by war. Courage persisted, often quietly, sometimes invisibly, always at great risk. By December 1943, the Allied leadership understood that they stood at the edge of a turning point. The previous years had been defined by catastrophe, survival, and painful rebuilding. But now, at last, the strategic equation favored them. The Soviet Union held the momentum in the east. The Allies held the skies over Germany. The Mediterranean campaign, though slow and costly, pressed steadily northward. And the coming invasion of France promised to add a new front that would stretch Germany beyond its breaking point. Every soldier sensed that 1944 would be the decisive year. Some wrote letters home with renewed hope. Others prayed silently, knowing that victory was close but not yet won. Across the world, a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation filled the air. The old world was dying. Something new, whether peaceful or violent, was being born in the fires of global conflict. And so as 1943 ended, the world did not find relief, but stood suspended on the edge of history's most critical threshold. The armies were in place. The plans were ready. The factories were humming. The seas were filled with ships. The skies with aircraft. The great collision that everyone sensed approaching, the final struggle for Europe, was now inevitable. What remained was to unleash it. As the calendar turned to early 1944, the world braced itself for an eruption that had been building since the very first shot of the war. The previous year had shattered the illusion of German invincibility and revealed the limits of Axis strength. But the coming months would determine whether the Allies could transform momentum into irreversible victory. In Berlin, corridors that once echoed with unwavering confidence now reverberated with uncertainty. Hitler moved between rage-filled tirades and unsettling moments of quiet delusion. His generals presented maps clogged with red arrows, Soviet advances pushing toward Ukraine, Allied bombing crippling railways, and Italian defenses slowly collapsing. Yet Hitler insisted that one decisive counterstroke would restore everything. He dreamed of new superweapons that would make his enemies tremble, convinced himself that the Allies would fracture over ideology, and still believed that Germany's willpower alone could crush the coalition opposing him. But beneath this fantasy, Germany was bleeding. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were scarred landscapes of rubble, where civilians sifted through dust, searching for belongings or loved ones. Train stations functioned partially. Factories worked around the clock under the threat of air raids. Food rations grew smaller, and electricity vanished for hours. Young boys barely old enough to grasp a rifle marched in Hitler youth drills, preparing to defend a shrinking Reich. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued the unrelenting pressure it had built through 1943. As snow blanketed the landscape, commanders surveyed their maps and assessed the damage inflicted upon the once formidable Wehrmacht. Entire German divisions had been reduced to ghostly remnants of their former strength. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and Soviet intelligence, improved dramatically through battlefield experience, identified every weak point left in the German front. Stalin, hardened by years of savage warfare, demanded the Red Army keep pushing despite bitter cold and staggering casualties. He knew that if the Soviets paused too long, the Germans might regroup. So despite frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant risk of sudden counterattacks, his armies dug trenches, scouted river crossings, and prepared for the next wave of offensives. Soviet factories, powered by women, elderly workers, and teenagers, churned out weapons faster than ever before. Long trains carrying T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and crates of ammunition wound through the snowy wilderness toward the front lines. Soldiers huddled in bunkers with metal stoves, drinking weak tea and counting the hours until their next advance order arrived. Political officers reminded them that every village retaken from the Germans was a step closer to survival, not just for themselves, but for their country and families. In Western Europe, Allied air power continued its thunderous assault. The skies became a battleground every day. The roar of B-17 engines, the howl of RAF bombers, and the screech of German anti-aircraft fire created a soundscape that German civilians would never forget. Families slept in bunkers. Children cried at the rumble of distant aircraft. Firefighters climbed ladders through burning streets, searching for survivors trapped in collapsed basements. Despite the horrors, the Allied bombing campaign was beginning to crack open the industrial shell of the German war machine. Oil production slowed. Rail transport faltered. Communication systems became unreliable. Fighter pilots who once flew confidently into the sky now faced overwhelming Allied numbers, and the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, struggled to defend its homeland. Across the Channel, Britain transformed into an armed fortress preparing for the greatest invasion ever attempted. Entire regions became military zones. Soldiers practiced storming mock beaches built along the English coast. Engineers tested amphibious tanks in freezing water. Commanders reviewed top-secret aerial photographs of Normandy terrain, memorizing every hedge, road, and farmhouse. Meanwhile, intelligence officers crafted one of the most elaborate deception operations in history. Fake armies made of inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, bogus radio traffic, and double agents feeding carefully constructed lies to German intelligence. They wanted the enemy to believe France would be invaded at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Every detail mattered, from forged orders to planted photographs to coded messages transmitted in ways the Germans expected to intercept. The entire deception effort became a symphony of shadows, and it worked so effectively that even Hitler believed the invasion would strike elsewhere. American troops poured into Britain in staggering numbers. Towns filled with soldiers wearing crisp uniforms, speaking with different accents, and carrying equipment unfamiliar to British civilians. Local pubs overflowed with laughter, flirtation, friendship, and occasional fights. British families hosted American soldiers at dinner tables, sharing stories of hardship and loss. And American soldiers, many of whom had grown up far from Europe, learned about blackout rules, rationing, and the emotional weight of fighting a war so far from home. Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery, and their staffs worked relentlessly to balance politics, ambition, and military necessity. The alliance was powerful but fragile. Each nation had its own priorities, each commander his own strategy. Yet they all knew the same truth. If the invasion failed, the war could last years longer, and the Axis might yet find ways to survive. In Italy, the struggle intensified. The Allies advanced inch by inch through mountains that seemed designed for defense. The Germans turned every village, hillside, and stone bridge into a fortress. Artillery shells echoed through valleys. Soldiers waded across cold rivers under machine gun fire. Supply lines bogged down in mud. Casualty lists grew heartbreakingly long, but the Allies adapted. They improved coordination between infantry and artillery. They built mountain roads where none existed. They rotated units more frequently to protect morale. Slowly, painfully, they pushed northward. Rome remained the ultimate prize, not just strategically but symbolically. Its liberation would signal to the world that fascism was dying. Yet as the armies clashed across continents, the Holocaust still raged. In 1944, the Nazis intensified the killing at a pace even more horrifying than before. New transports arrived at Auschwitz. Deportations from Hungary began. And yet resistance also grew stronger. Jewish partisans in forests sabotaged German trains. Prisoners smuggled information to the Allies. Even in the heart of the camps, uprisings occurred, proving that even in the darkest corners of human suffering, the spark of defiance remained. These acts, though small in the face of genocide, symbolized humanity's refusal to be erased. Back in Germany, the home front began to fracture. Supplies dwindled. Bread lines grew longer. Civilians whispered doubts they dared not speak aloud. Soldiers on leave saw their shattered cities and wondered whether victory was still possible. Officers fought bitterly over strategies. Some believed the war was lost but feared saying so. Others clung stubbornly to Hitler's promises of miracle weapons. The German people, burdened by propaganda, fear, and exhaustion, continued to work, fight, and endure. But cracks were widening everywhere. By spring, the stage was nearly set. The Red Army prepared massive offensives to crush German forces in Ukraine and Belarus. The Allies finalized their invasion plans. German commanders scrambled to reposition units, reinforce defenses, and guess where the next blow would fall. No one knew exactly when the storm would break, but all sensed that the world was moving toward a climax, unlike anything seen before. The war had raged for nearly 5 years, reshaped continents, destroyed cities, and consumed millions of lives. Now at last, the forces aligned for a final showdown that would decide the fate of nations, ideologies, and generations. The first warm winds of late spring blew across Europe, but they brought no comfort. They carried the scent of burning oil fields, shattered forests, and battlefields stretching from the Black Sea to the English Channel. For soldiers on every front, the sun no longer meant renewal. It simply meant clearer skies for fighters and bombers to hunt, and longer days for offensives that would push men to their limits. The war was accelerating, gathering momentum like a machine that could no longer slow down. Across the vast Eastern Front, Soviet commanders surveyed territories they had bled for, cities reduced to ruins but flying the red banner once more. The liberation of Ukraine had reignited national pride. Families emerging from hiding, survivors embracing soldiers, and villages ringing church bells for the first time in months or years. Yet behind the celebration lay a harsh truth. Every victory revealed new graves, burned homes, and stories of unimaginable cruelty. Entire communities had vanished during the occupation. Soviet soldiers listened to testimonies of massacres committed by retreating German units, and their anger hardened into an even fiercer resolve. Stalin and his front commanders planned new offensives with icy precision. They intended to break Army Group Center and destroy the German presence in Belarus. Supplies moved relentlessly along newly repaired railroads. Fresh divisions arrived from the Far East, seasoned by brutal winter training. And thousands of Soviet women, snipers, medics, radio operators, and pilots, occupying vital roles, symbolized how fully society had mobilized for total war. The Red Army's confidence grew. They believed that each step westward, each mile reclaimed from German control, brought them closer to final justice. In German headquarters, exhaustion seeped into every decision. Commanders argued over where to place their dwindling reserves. Some pleaded for strategic withdrawals to shorten the front and save troops. Hitler refused. His fixation on symbolic cities, Kiev, Minsk, even small towns, ensured countless unnecessary deaths. He ordered divisions to hold ground until the last bullet, even when logic demanded retreat. Many officers wondered in private whether the Führer still understood the reality of the war. Yet despite crumbling morale, German soldiers continued to fight with grim determination. Defensive lines were dug across fields and forests, anti-tank guns were concealed behind farmhouses, and machine gun nests constructed in basements. Experienced NCOs held squads together, even as replacements arrived with barely a week of training. They fought not merely for victory, but for survival, knowing that the Soviet advance meant retaliation, fear, and the unknown. In the West, German commanders scrambled to decode Allied intentions. Reports arrived of enormous troop buildups in southern England, endless convoys of American Sherman tanks, and strange sightings of inflatable vehicles that looked like tanks but weighed nothing. Some intelligence officers questioned the authenticity of this mysterious First U.S. Army Group, supposedly preparing to strike Calais. Others accepted it without doubt. The deception worked so thoroughly that even veteran officers believed they were clever enough to see through it, unaware that the deception was precisely tailored for men like them. Meanwhile, the Allies perfected their war machine. Airfields across rural England boomed with activity day and night. Pilots studied reconnaissance photographs showing every hedgerow, farm, and bunker along the French coast. Mechanics tuned engines with meticulous care. Infantry units practiced amphibious landings on cold beaches in Scotland and Wales, repeatedly storming shores under simulated fire. Soldiers grew accustomed to the taste of sand in their mouths and the sting of salt water on their skin. Officers drilled their men until every order became reflex. General Eisenhower, burdened with the responsibility of millions of lives, walked through headquarters at night, reviewing maps under dim lamps. He worried endlessly about weather, tides, moonlight, and coordination. A single miscalculation could doom the invasion. His mind replayed the disasters of Gallipoli and Dieppe, reminders of how amphibious assaults could turn catastrophic. Yet he trusted his planners, and believed the soldiers deserved the best chance possible. When he visited camps, troops greeted him with cheers, unaware of the weight he carried. He studied their youthful faces, their determination, and their fear, knowing many would never return. The British public watched the buildup with a mix of curiosity and dread. The war was part of daily life: rationing, blackouts, ruined streets from bombings. But now the island seemed to tremble with anticipation. Mothers wrote letters to sons stationed nearby but forbidden to discuss their missions. Children played in fields beside camouflaged vehicles, unaware of the battles soon to erupt just across the sea. Newspapers hinted at important operations coming soon, but censors ensured nothing more specific appeared in print. The entire nation held its breath. In the Mediterranean, the fight for Italy became a contest of endurance. At Monte Cassino, Allied forces engaged in one of the most brutal struggles of the entire war. Steep slopes, ancient stone walls, and fortified German positions created a natural fortress that resisted assault after assault. Artillery shook the mountains until ancient statues toppled and clouds of dust blanketed the valleys below. When the monastery itself, misunderstood by Allied commanders as a German stronghold, was bombed, the world watched in shock. Although the Germans had not occupied it before, they quickly entrenched themselves in the ruins afterward, making the Allied task even harder. Soldiers from across the world, Indians, Poles, New Zealanders, Americans, Moroccans, fought and died on those slopes. And yet, despite staggering losses, the Allies eventually broke through, pushing the Germans north toward Rome. Still, each victory came at a cost that weighed heavily on morale. Letters from the front described mud-filled foxholes, relentless artillery, and the eerie silence after bombardments when soldiers checked whether their friends were still alive. Casualty lists grew longer in newspapers, and churches filled with grieving families. Italy became a bloody reminder that even with momentum, the Allies could not win without sacrifice. In the Atlantic, the tide had turned decisively against Germany. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park decoded U-boat communications more precisely than ever. Convoys now sailed with stronger escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and long-range aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges. German submarine crews found themselves hunted relentlessly. Some boats left port knowing they had little chance of returning. Endurance and courage could not compensate for overwhelming Allied technological superiority. The turning of the Atlantic War ensured that supplies, fuel, ammunition, and troops would reach Britain in massive quantities, an essential foundation for the coming invasion. On the home fronts, the human cost of war became clearer to everyone. In America, factories worked day and night. Women welded steel, riveted aircraft frames, and assembled engines. Posters urged citizens to buy war bonds, conserve food, and keep silent about troop movements. Yet despite unity, the war felt both distant and personal. Sons leaving for Europe or the Pacific, telegrams delivering devastating news, and newspapers showing photographs of smoldering cities overseas. In Germany, civilians endured a living nightmare. Food shortages became severe. Coal supplies ran low, leaving families shivering in the winter months. Air raid sirens wailed almost daily. Mothers clutched children as they descended into bunkers, listening to bombs whistle and explode overhead. Streets became fields of rubble where handwritten signs pointed toward surviving hospitals or water stations. The government promised revenge and miracle weapons, but faith in these promises waned with every raid. Despite their suffering, many civilians worked tirelessly in armaments factories, assembling weapons that would be used to defend a regime many no longer believed in. Fear of the Gestapo kept dissent quiet. Propaganda insisted that surrender would bring destruction worse than war. Ordinary citizens found themselves trapped between terror from above and terror within their own borders. As all sides prepared for the next phase, the Holocaust pressed on with grim efficiency. Transports from Hungary arrived at Auschwitz almost daily, overwhelming the camp's capacity. Prisoners whispered rumors of Allied advances, but liberation seemed impossibly distant. Still, acts of resistance persisted. Some prisoners sabotaged machinery. Others documented atrocities in secret diaries or buried notes near the barracks, hoping someone would one day read the truth. In the forests of Eastern Europe, Jewish partisans ambushed German patrols, liberated small groups of prisoners, and disrupted supply lines. Each act, no matter how small, became a spark of humanity amid darkness. And so Europe stood on a knife's edge. Soviet armies prepared to launch offensives that would carve through Belarus and drive toward Poland. The Allies in the West were weeks away from an operation that would change history. German forces, battered but desperate, dug in for a fight they could not afford to lose. Civilians across the continent prayed for the end, feared what the end might bring, and endured daily uncertainty. The war had reached a point where every decision, every bullet, every gust of wind seemed part of an enormous chain of events shaping the future of millions. Nothing about the next phase would be quick. Nothing would be easy. But the world sensed that something enormous was coming, an explosion of force across land, sea, and sky that would determine the fate of nations and end the illusion that the war could be contained any longer. Europe was about to be remade. The only question was how much more blood would be shed before peace finally came. The summer of 1944 approached with a tension so heavy that even the wind seemed to carry it. Every soldier, commander, civilian, and spy felt the world shifting towards something irreversible. Europe was a continent holding its breath. People walked through shattered streets wondering when the next thunder would come. Thunder from artillery, from aircraft engines, or from the shattering of a front line that had once seemed immovable. And far away from the front, farmers looked up at the sky as columns of bombers passed overhead, like migrating steel birds traveling to a place from which many would never return. In the east, Soviet preparations for a massive offensive continued with a precision and scale that dwarfed anything they had attempted before. The Red Army's intelligence network mapped German positions down to individual bunkers. Engineers surveyed river crossings, ensuring that bridges could be thrown across raging waters in a matter of hours. Fuel depots were hidden in forests, artillery lined up in rows stretching beyond the horizon, and infantry divisions drilled relentlessly. The Soviet soldier of 1944 was no longer the panicked recruit of 1941. He was hardened by 3 years of brutal war, molded by failure, revenge, and necessity. His commanders had mastered combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, aircraft, and artillery striking, in coordinated blows like the organs of a single, relentless machine. German commanders facing them sensed the storm. Reports from reconnaissance units described unusual Soviet movements. Prisoners spoke of new tanks, new units, and endless supply trains. But Berlin ignored these warnings, or dismissed them as exaggeration. Hitler insisted that the Eastern Front was stable. He believed the Red Army was depleted and incapable of launching major offensives. He refused to redeploy divisions from France or the Balkans. He clung to the fantasy that his generals could hold their positions through sheer force of will. Meanwhile, along the French coast, German soldiers looked out at the stormy channel as if watching the edge of the world. Many were barely 18 or 19 years old, assigned to static divisions with outdated equipment. They lived in bunkers that reeked of oil and damp concrete, spent hours watching the waves, and wondered whether the next silhouette on the horizon would be a fishing boat or the vanguard of an invasion. Veterans from the Eastern Front, transferred to the Atlantic Wall, sensed immediately that the defenses were inadequate. They saw overextended units, poorly placed gun positions, and a false sense of security born from propaganda. But their warnings were lost in a hierarchy where no one dared challenge Hitler's convictions. German intelligence, flooded with decoy radio signals and manipulated reports from Allied double agents, remained convinced that the real invasion would come at Calais. Normandy seemed unlikely, its beaches narrower, its roads few, its terrain unpredictable. And so, in the weeks before the invasion, the Germans stationed some of their best armored divisions far from where they would be needed. They waited for an attack that would never come. Across the Channel, the Allied machine tightened its final bolts. Soldiers received last-minute briefings in crowded tents. Maps were rolled out. Officers reviewed landing sectors with red pencils. Engineers studied tide charts and doctoral-level calculations about sand firmness. Paratroopers practiced fastening their gear in complete darkness. Chaplains visited barracks, offering prayers or quiet conversations to men who feared admitting their terror. Some soldiers wrote letters to loved ones they might never see again, sealing them with hands that trembled despite their training. Others joked loudly, masking their fear with laughter. On air bases, mechanics fueled and armed bombers for a wave of pre-invasion strikes. Pilots inspected their aircraft with ritualistic precision. They knew that a malfunction could doom hundreds of men depending on their accuracy. Ships filled the southern ports. Destroyers, landing craft, cruisers, troop transports. The sea bristled with steel, every vessel part of a single colossal purpose. All around England, civilians sensed something monumental was about to unfold. Roads filled with military convoys. Railways groaned under the weight of troops and ammunition. Entire villages were sealed off, surrounded by guards to prevent leaks. Families living near coastal cliffs watched warships gather like storm clouds. Blackout curtains hung over windows, but the night sky glowed faintly with reflections of the immense armada preparing just offshore. The date approached. Eisenhower watched weather reports with a grim expression. Storms churned across the Atlantic, threatening to delay or even cancel the invasion. Meteorologists argued, debated, and finally predicted a small window of opportunity, just enough to launch the operation. Eisenhower made the decision in the early hours of morning, his voice steady but heavy with responsibility. With that order, the fate of Europe began to move. As the invasion approached, German cities once again trembled under bombardment. RAF and USAAF bombers attacked rail networks, communication hubs, and airfields to prevent German reinforcements from reaching France quickly. Civilians huddled in basements, clutching rosaries, photographs, or simply blankets against the cold. Each explosion shook dust from the walls. Children cried quietly in their parents' arms. Firefighters raced through the streets, ignoring the danger as buildings collapsed around them. These raids weren't just tactical, they were psychological, weakening the resolve of a nation already near collapse. But even with devastation around them, many German civilians refused to believe defeat was coming. Propaganda insisted the Reich would unveil secret weapons, that the Allies were weak, divided, and cowardly. Newspapers claimed the invasion would be crushed in hours. Loudspeakers blared speeches about resilience and sacrifice. Yet as sirens wailed night after night, the truth became harder to ignore. The walls of German homes shook with every explosion, as if reminding families that the war they had once celebrated was closing in. In Italy, Allied troops fought their way toward Rome. The German retreat, though inevitable, remained fierce. Every bridge became a trap. Every hillside hid snipers or machine gun nests. Yet the Allies learned, adapted, and endured. They launched coordinated assaults under smoke cover, rotated divisions efficiently, and finally, in June, entered Rome. One of the most symbolic victories of the entire war. The capture of the city electrified Allied morale, even as preparations for the invasion of France reached their climax. Farther east, Soviet forces launched shock attacks across multiple fronts, smashing German lines with overwhelming artillery barrages that lasted hours. The ground trembled as thousands of cannons unleashed fire into trenches, bunkers, and forests. Soldiers pressed their faces into the earth, praying the barrage would end before they lost their minds. When the artillery finally lifted, waves of Soviet infantry surged forward. Tanks clattered through fields, crushing barbed wire and wooden obstacles beneath their tracks. Flamethrower teams advanced behind them, clearing bunkers. The offensive ripped open German defenses in ways that stunned even the Soviet high command. As German units collapsed, tens of thousands surrendered or retreated in disorganized columns. Some officers still believed they could restore order, but most understood the truth. The Eastern Front was becoming unsustainable. Supplies dwindled. Morale plummeted. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, now looked over its shoulder at the unstoppable tide approaching from the east. Behind the front lines, the brutality of occupation became impossible to hide. Soviet soldiers found mass graves, burned villages, and survivors who had endured years of abuse. News of these crimes spread rapidly through the ranks, deepening their resolve. Soldiers vowed they would push the Germans all the way back to Berlin, no matter how many more battles it required. Resistance movements across Europe also intensified their efforts. French partisans sabotaged railways, cut telegraph lines, and attacked German patrols. Polish underground fighters transmitted intelligence to London, gathered weapons, and waited for the moment to rise. Yugoslav partisans ambushed convoys, liberated towns, and tied down entire German divisions. From Norway to Greece, occupied nations fought in the shadows, preparing to strike when the Allied armies approached. Back in Germany, whispers spread through military circles. Some officers believed the Führer had lost his grasp on reality. Some contemplated assassination. Others resigned themselves to doom, and the civilian population endured their own quiet rebellion, listening secretly to BBC broadcasts, exchanging rationed bread with neighbors, and writing letters filled with truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Meanwhile, the Allies in Britain completed their final preparations. Paratroopers painted black stripes under their eyes. Infantry loaded their rifles, checked their packs, and climbed aboard landing craft. Navy crews took positions at the guns. Pilots received their final coordinates. Radios crackled with coded signals. Slowly, silently, the greatest armada in human history began to move toward France. Reports drifted in from the Channel, rough waves, strong winds, unstable skies. But the invasion force pushed forward. Ships rocked violently. Soldiers vomited from seasickness. Landing craft slammed into each wave like a hammer against stone, but no one turned back. They knew that the moment the ramps opened, they would be in the crucible of history. As darkness fell, the armada pressed on. Commanders on both sides stared into the night, aware that by dawn, the world would be changed forever. This was no longer a question of strategy. It was a collision between empires, ideologies, and the raw determination of millions who had suffered too much to allow the war to continue any longer. Dawn crept closer, engines roared, waves crashed, radios crackled, and the world held its breath, waiting for the moment when fire and steel would descend upon the shores of France, marking the beginning of the end for a regime that had once seemed unstoppable. The next hours would define the fate of continents. By the early months of 1944, Europe waited like a continent holding its breath. Every front, every factory, every political chamber felt the vibration of a storm building somewhere just beyond the horizon. Soldiers sensed it in the way orders became sharper and training harsher. Civilians felt it in the increased urgency of propaganda. Commanders felt it in the silence of their own thoughts during sleepless nights. The war was entering a phase where every decision, every delay, every mistake could tilt history itself. Germany stood positioned between collapse and defiance, its armies still fighting ferociously, but forced to retreat again and again. The Allies, powerful yet cautious, prepared to strike decisively, but they knew a single failed operation could turn momentum into catastrophe. For Germany, 1944 opened not with a sense of renewal, but with dread. At Führer headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler studied his maps obsessively. Lines on the Eastern Front pressed dangerously close to pre-war German borders. Italian resistance crumbled further each week. The Western Allies massed troops at levels never before seen. Yet Hitler refused to accept that his armies were overextended beyond repair. He believed that every setback, Stalingrad, Kursk, North Africa, Sicily, had been caused by weak subordinates or insufficient willpower, never by flawed strategy. His generals increasingly avoided confrontation, knowing his rage had become unpredictable and sometimes impossible to reason with. When he pounded his fist on the table and declared that Germany must never retreat another step, commanders exchanged uneasy glances, aware that strategic withdrawal was the only way to prevent encirclement. But few dared to openly challenge him. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army prepared to unleash operations of unprecedented scale. Even after the massive casualties of 1943, Soviet manpower seemed endless. New tanks rolled from factories deep in the Urals, fresh units trained through winter storms, practicing river assaults, defensive breakouts, and combined arms maneuvers. Many soldiers were young, barely old enough to shave, but Soviet officers cared less about age than willingness to obey orders. Veterans hardened by years of brutal conflict became mentors for new recruits. Around campfires, they told stories of earlier battles, the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the cauldron at Kursk, the liberation of Kyiv. The young soldiers listened intently, understanding that their survival depended on learning from those who had already defied impossible odds. Soviet morale was complex. The troops knew victory was approaching, but they also understood the price still ahead. Every kilometer gained across Ukraine and Belarus meant more minefields, more trenches, more burned villages, more desperate counterattacks by German formations unwilling to yield. But they pushed forward with a resolve born from suffering. They fought not only to defeat an invader, but to reclaim land, families, and dignity stolen from them since the fateful summer of 1941. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the Allied air offensive intensified with brutal consistency. The skies above Germany became deadly corridors filled with contrails, explosions, and smoke. Bombing raids no longer targeted only factories and railways. They aimed to break the backbone of German logistics, morale, and capacity to fight. P-51 Mustangs with long-range tanks now escorted bombers deep into the heart of the Reich, slashing through German fighter formations that had once dominated the air. Luftwaffe losses mounted. Ace pilots were irreplaceable, and the new trainees arriving at frontline units lacked both experience and confidence. As Germany's air defenses weakened, Allied planners began to see the extraordinary potential of sustained air superiority. They understood that if the Luftwaffe could be neutralized, the invasion of Western Europe would become far more feasible. Inside Britain, the buildup reached levels unimaginable only months before. Millions of tons of supplies arrived from across the Atlantic. Tanks, jeeps, fuel drums, radio equipment, medical kits, and everything else a modern army might need to cross the sea and fight across a continent. The network of bases, airfields, barracks, ports, and staging grounds grew into a vast military machine, humming with an energy the enemy could not see but would soon feel. Each day, British civilians watched convoys of American trucks rolling through small towns, carrying soldiers who were preparing to fight for a land they had never seen. Training intensified. Beaches along the English coast became rehearsal grounds where troops practiced storming fortified positions under simulated fire. Engineers tested amphibious vehicles in rough seas. Demolition teams learned how to clear mines under pressure. Paratroopers conducted night jumps, perfecting the skill of landing silently despite chaos. Commanders reviewed reconnaissance photographs so detailed that they could identify individual fence posts along the target beaches. The pressure weighed heavily on Eisenhower, who had been appointed Supreme Commander of Operation Overlord. He often walked alone at night, contemplating the weight of the decision he would soon make. More than 150,000 soldiers would land on a single day. Thousands might die within minutes. If the invasion failed, it would take years to rebuild the necessary strength for another attempt, and Stalin, already distrustful, might even negotiate with Germany. The fate of Europe rested on one gamble, and Eisenhower knew it. Germany, despite its weakening position, remained an enemy capable of terrible resistance. On the coast of France, soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS dug bunkers, laid mines, and constructed obstacles. The Atlantic Wall, though incomplete and overrated in propaganda, still posed a formidable danger. German engineers built anti-tank ditches, concrete gun positions, and steel obstacles known as Rommel's asparagus, sharp stakes intended to impale gliders and landing craft. Field Marshal Rommel himself, tasked with strengthening coastal defenses, inspected fortifications personally. He believed the Allies must be stopped on the beaches. If they secured a foothold, Germany would lose the war. He urged Hitler to pour resources into coastal defenses and emphasized that the Allies' air power made mobile counterattacks nearly impossible. But Rommel's warnings often clashed with Hitler's fantasies, and precious time slipped away. As spring warmed the English Channel, German intelligence tried desperately to predict the invasion site. Reports from spies, intercepted messages, reconnaissance flights, and logical assessments pointed to multiple locations, but none definitively. The Allies' deception plan, Operation Fortitude, worked brilliantly. German analysts concluded that the largest threat lay at Pas-de-Calais, where the coastline was closest to Britain. The fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, seemed poised to strike. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and dummy installations fooled the German High Command entirely. Divisions that might have reinforced Normandy remained pinned far to the northeast, waiting for an attack that would never come. The final weeks before the invasion were a mixture of tension and routine. Soldiers wrote letters home, polished their weapons, and practiced one last time. Chaplains offered quiet words. Commanders reviewed contingency plans. Some troops found brief comfort in pubs. Others tried to sleep, but found themselves restless, staring at ceilings as their minds replayed the possibilities of the days ahead. In Berlin, Hitler sensed the invasion was coming, but could not pinpoint where or when. He believed the Atlantic Wall was capable of inflicting massive casualties. He convinced himself that Germany would repel the assault and that the Allies, demoralized, would delay future attempts. But beneath the bravado, his grip on reality slipped faster than ever. His health deteriorated, his temper worsened. He trusted only a shrinking circle of loyalists. Many generals privately concluded that the war was unwinnable, yet they feared admitting it. Even as reports arrived of lost cities, shattered divisions, and worsening shortages, Hitler clung to the belief that the enemy coalition would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. But the Allies were united by one goal: destroy the Nazi regime. As May 1944 ended, the stage was set. The armada assembled in southern England was the largest in human history. Thousands of ships ready to cross the Channel the moment Eisenhower gave the order. Weather became the only unpredictable factor. Storms rolled across the Channel, delaying the operation and forcing nervous commanders to wait. Hours felt like days. Every delay heightened the risk of German detection. Meteorologists debated fiercely in darkened war rooms. Then finally, a narrow window appeared. June 6, 1944. Eisenhower issued the order. Germany was about to face the full force of the Allied world. Europe was about to explode into the final, decisive battles of the Second World War. By early June 1944, the English Channel transformed into a waiting battlefield. Every ship, every soldier, every commander felt the same rising tension. Someone had finally pulled the bowstring of history to its limit, and now it was trembling, seconds before release. D-Day was no longer a plan on paper. It was a storm about to break. The Allied Armada, over 5,000 ships, stretched across the horizon like an iron wall. Battleships that once ruled oceans took their places beside tiny landing craft that would soon carry terrified young soldiers toward fortified beaches. In the early hours of June 6th, wind and waves tossed vessels like toys, but inside each, troops waited in a silence heavy with fear, prayer, and destiny. Across the Channel, German sentries paced bunkers along the Atlantic Wall. Many still believed the main invasion would strike Pas de Calais. Normandy seemed quiet, almost tranquil. Rommel himself wasn't even at his post. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. The German High Command had misread every clue, and fate punished them for it. At 00:15 a.m., the sky over Normandy roared open as Allied paratroopers jumped into darkness, lit only by flak and tracer fire. Thousands of men scattered across fields, marshes, hedgerows, many landing miles from their intended zones. Some drowned in flooded fields, others were shot before unclipping their chutes. But enough survived, regrouped, and began the silent work of sabotage, securing roads and bridges that would protect the beach landings at dawn. Then, just before sunrise, the naval bombardment began. The coast shook, bunkers cracked, shore defenses erupted into fire and smoke. And through the thunder, landing craft advanced, riding waves, smashing through spray, filled with men gripping rifles so tightly their knuckles whitened. Utah Beach saw luck. Currents pulled landing craft a kilometer off course, but onto a lightly defended sector. American forces advanced rapidly, taking minimal casualties. Officers radioed, "We are too far south." The reply came back with dry relief. "Then stay there." But Omaha Beach was a nightmare. High cliffs, overlapping machine gun nests, and intact German fortifications turned the shoreline into a killing ground. The first waves were mowed down. Bodies floated in crimson surf. Tanks sank in rough waters. Many soldiers never even made it out of their landing craft. Officers were killed instantly, leaving privates to lead themselves. Smoke, screams, and explosions filled the air as men crawled behind obstacles, searching for any cover. Yet from that carnage, courage emerged. Small groups began to push forward, climbing cliffs under constant fire. Engineers blew gaps in barbed wire. Riflemen crawled through sand, inch by inch. By midday, despite horrific losses, the Americans broke through. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, the resistance varied. Canadians at Juno faced brutal fighting, but pushed inland faster than anyone. British troops seized key bridges and villages, linking with airborne units. By nightfall, a fragile but real foothold existed across all 5 beaches. Germany's response was chaotic. Conflicting orders, confusion over the invasion's true location, and Hitler's stubborn refusal to release panzer divisions without his personal approval delayed the counterattack for precious hours. By the time German armor moved, Allied air power hammered it relentlessly from above. By the end of June 6th, nearly 160,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The beachheads were connected. The Atlantic Wall, the pride of Nazi propaganda, had been pierced. D-Day did not end the war, but it made something else certain. Germany would lose it. The road to Paris, Belgium, and ultimately Berlin had just opened. And from this moment onward, the Reich was fighting not for victory, but for survival. The days after D-Day were not a smooth advance. They were a grinding, brutal struggle through the ancient hedgerows of Normandy. These hedgerows, thick earth walls covered in tangled greenery, turned every field into a fortress. Each one hid machine guns, snipers, mines, and German ambushes waiting patiently for the Allies to step forward. American, British, and Canadian troops called it the Green Hell. Every 100 meters demanded blood. Progress was measured in yards, not kilometers. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Infantry couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. German paratroopers, SS units, and experienced infantry exploited this terrain with deadly precision. Yet slowly, steadily, the Allies adapted, building hedgerow cutters for their tanks, coordinating closer air support, and learning to fight within a claustrophobic maze of foliage and smoke. As July heated the French countryside, the Allies prepared a decisive blow: Operation Cobra. On July 25th, the sky over German lines darkened with thousands of Allied bombers. In a deafening storm of explosives, entire defensive sectors vanished under clouds of dust and fire. The bombardment was so intense that even battle-hardened German veterans found themselves disoriented, stunned, or buried alive. Once the dust settled, American armor surged forward. For the first time since Normandy began, the front broke wide open. Hundreds of tanks poured into the gap created by the bombardment. Infantry followed rapidly, bypassing pockets of resistance, leaving isolated German units trapped behind them. What had begun as a slow crawl now transformed into a race. The German command structure crumbled. Communications broke down. Counterattacks were piecemeal and easily crushed. Allied planes roamed freely, striking any vehicle that dared to move in daylight. Then came the decisive moment: the Falaise Pocket. German forces retreating from Normandy attempted to escape through a narrow corridor near Falaise. For days, that corridor became a killing zone. Allied artillery, tanks, infantry, and aircraft created a storm of fire on the desperate German columns attempting to flee. The roads became carpeted with burned-out vehicles, twisted metal, dead horses, shattered tanks, and soldiers who never made it out. Survivors described it as the corridor of death. Even with horrific losses, a portion of German forces escaped, but at a price they could never repay. The German army in France was effectively destroyed. With Normandy secured, the Allies surged across France. British forces pushed toward Belgium. Canadians swept through coastal defenses. Americans liberated immense stretches of territory at breathtaking speed, town after town cheering them forward. Resistance fighters sabotaged German supply lines, blew bridges, cut phone lines, and guided Allied units through unfamiliar terrain. Paris, after 4 years under occupation, became the heart of a growing rebellion. On August 19th, French resistance fighters rose up, seizing police stations, barricading streets, and engaging German forces in fierce urban battles. The city pulsed with gunfire, courage, and desperation. Hitler ordered Paris to be destroyed if it could not be held. But General Dietrich von Koltitz, aware of the war's inevitable outcome, refused to carry out the order. He surrendered the city intact. On August 25th, American and Free French forces entered Paris to thunderous celebration. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, climbing tanks, embracing soldiers. The bells of Notre Dame rang for the first time since 1940. Paris was free. And with its liberation, German domination of Western Europe began to collapse in a cascading chain reaction. Belgium, Luxembourg, and large parts of the Netherlands soon followed. German troops, exhausted and depleted, fell back toward their homeland under relentless Allied pursuit. Now only one major barrier remained before the Allies could invade Germany itself: the Rhine. The final phase of the war was approaching, a phase more desperate, more chaotic, and more violent than anything the world had yet seen. While the Allies liberated France in the west, an even more devastating hammer was rising in the east. The Red Army, rearmed, reorganized, and burning with the memory of millions dead, prepared the largest single offensive of the entire Second World War, Operation Bagration, June 1944. Across a 1,000-kilometer front stretching through Belarus, Soviet forces massed silently in forests, marshlands, and villages. Nearly 2.3 million men, 800 tanks, 30,000 guns, and thousands of aircraft waited for a signal. They faced Germany's Army Group Center, once feared as the Reich's elite formation. Now weakened and under-resourced, it stood directly in the path of the largest military storm in recorded history. On June 22nd, the anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, hell opened. Soviet artillery erupted like the earth itself had cracked apart. For hours, waves of shells plowed through German lines, smashing communication posts, burying trenches, and tearing apart entire battalions before they could even react. Survivors recalled the bombardment as not a bombardment but a natural disaster. Through smoke and fire, Soviet infantry advanced, followed closely by tanks and ground attack aircraft, hunting anything that moved. German lines shattered almost instantly. Army Group Center had no reserves, no armored divisions in depth, and no strategic flexibility left. Hitler's orders, to stand fast, hold every village, retreat nowhere, turned German units into trapped islands, swallowed by the Red Army's momentum. Cities like Vitebsk, Mogilev, Bobruisk became tombs. Entire divisions vanished in encirclements. German soldiers fled through burning forests, swamps, and flooded rivers. Supply lines collapsed, command structures dissolved. Soviet tank armies roared forward, bypassing pockets of resistance and cutting off escape routes. Within days, what had once been the backbone of the Eastern Front was reduced to ashes. Field Marshal Bush lost control. Hitler replaced him with Walter Model, the firefighter of the Eastern Front. But even he couldn't extinguish this inferno. Soviet forces advanced so fast that maps became useless. Roads overflowed with retreating German remnants mixed with civilians desperate to escape. By early July, Minsk fell. Another massive pocket formed east of the city, over 100,000 Germans surrounded. When Soviet troops closed the ring, the sky filled with artillery fire and the ground with broken steel. Few escaped. In less than a month, Army Group Center, 4 entire German armies had been annihilated. This was not a defeat. This was obliteration. German generals later admitted they had never experienced destruction on such a scale, not even at Stalingrad. The Eastern Front had cracked wide open. Soviet soldiers pushed west like a tidal wave, sweeping through Lithuania, eastern Poland, and all the way to the gates of East Prussia, the first territory of Germany itself. For civilians inside East Prussia, the realization was chilling. The Red Army was coming, and they carried the rage of 3 years of slaughter, starvation, and destruction. Hitler refused to believe the scale of the disaster. In briefings he shouted, denied reports, demanded counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed. But no denial could change the reality. The Eastern Front was collapsing. By the end of 1944, the Soviet Union had driven deep into German-held Europe. Romania and Bulgaria switched sides. Hungary became a battlefield, and German positions everywhere began to buckle. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied armies pushed toward the Rhine. Germany, once seemingly unstoppable, was now being crushed from both directions. The noose was tightening, and soon the Reich would make one last desperate gamble in the West. A counterstrike meant to shock the world and reverse the fate of the war. Winter fell over Europe like a steel curtain. Snow coated the forests of Belgium and the Ardennes, muffling the war's thunder, just long enough for Hitler to plan one final, desperate counterstroke. A blow he believed could still turn the tide. The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the quiet froze, and then shattered. 600 German artillery guns opened fire across a 130-kilometer front. Shells rained down on American positions lost in fog and freezing rain. Communication wires snapped, outposts vanished, and entire regiments were stunned by the sudden fury. Then came the tanks. King Tigers and Panthers rolled through the mist, engines growling like beasts awakened. Thousands of German infantry followed, shouting and charging through snowdrifts. The Americans, spread thin in quiet sectors, were caught completely off guard. Within hours, the German line smashed forward, driving deep into the Ardennes. On Allied maps, the front bulged outward, hence the name. This was Hitler's gamble: split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. In his mind, if the West collapsed, he could turn all remaining strength back to the East and face the Soviets alone. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. American units fell back. Supply dumps were overrun. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. German commandos in stolen U.S. uniforms infiltrated checkpoints, spreading confusion and sabotage. But in this chaos, American grit hardened. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored Division dug in, surrounded, freezing, low on food and ammunition. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave a one-word reply: "Nuts." The message echoed across American lines like a spark in the dark. Meanwhile, Patton, 200 miles to the south, did the impossible. In just 48 hours, he pivoted his entire Third Army north, tearing through snowstorms to rescue Bastogne. His armored columns smashed into German flanks, beating back elite SS tank units. The weather cleared. Allied planes, grounded for days, filled the sky. Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons pounced on exposed German tanks. Convoys burned. Panzer divisions that had once punched through American lines now struggled even to move, starved of fuel. German soldiers realized the truth. There would be no miracle victory. There was no fuel, no reserves, and no hope. By January 1945, the bulge collapsed. Germany had spent its last strength on an attack that failed to even delay the inevitable. From this moment onward, the Reich had nothing left but retreat. The collapse begins. In the east, the Red Army launched its own winter offensive. Within weeks, it overran Poland, stormed across the Vistula, and surged into Germany itself. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine with overwhelming force. Cities fell one by one: Cologne, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt. The Third Reich was shrinking month by month, day by day. German soldiers were exhausted. Civilians fled burning cities. Commanders argued with Hitler, who now issued orders disconnected from reality. Rumors spread through German ranks: "The Soviets are coming." And behind that sentence lay fear, revenge, and the memory of millions dead in the East. The war was entering its final, brutal chapter. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, was next. In the final months of the war, Germany was a collapsing giant, bleeding, burning, and broken. By April 1945, the Red Army had surrounded Berlin from every direction. Artillery thundered day and night, shaking the city to its core. Buildings crumbled, streets burned, and civilians hid in basements with nothing but fear and fading hope. The Reich that once promised a 1,000-year empire was dying in less than 12. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler raged against reality. He issued commands to divisions that no longer existed and cursed generals who had already deserted or been killed. His empire had shrunk to a few square kilometers of ruins, yet he still imagined victory. Above him, Soviet tanks smashed through the city, moving street by street, block by block. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth fought with Panzerfausts. Old men from the Volkssturm dragged machine guns into doorways. Exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers defended intersections with the last few bullets they had. But the Red Army came like a storm of steel. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers, grenades echoed through doorways, and artillery strikes erased entire neighborhoods. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a battlefield of rubble, smoke, and death. By April 29th, the Soviets were only a few hundred meters from the bunker. Hitler, pale and shaking, married Eva Braun in a small ceremony underground. He dictated his final will, blaming everyone but himself for the disaster that had consumed Europe. The next afternoon, he retreated into his private room with Eva. A single gunshot echoed, and guards realized the man who brought the world to war was dead. His body was burned in the garden above as Soviet shells fell around the bunker. The Reich he built through fear and blood ended in fire and silence. With Hitler gone, there was nothing left to fight for. Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. Across Europe, German forces laid down their arms. Some fled west hoping to surrender to the Americans. Others were captured by the advancing Soviets. On May 7th-8th, Germany finally signed unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Celebrations erupted across the world. Church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, soldiers embraced, and for the first time in years, people looked toward the sky and saw peace instead of bombers. But victory came with unimaginable loss. Germany lay in ruins. Over 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. Tens of millions of civilians and soldiers across Europe were dead. Cities were shattered, families destroyed, and entire nations left scarred. Yet from the ashes, a new world began to rise. The Allies divided Germany, held war crimes trials, rebuilt shattered cities, and tried to create a future where such horror could never happen again. 1945 was not only the end of a war, it was the rebirth of humanity after walking through darkness.